Hello, I'm Julie Levitt-Learson at Fairfield University, and welcome to my talk on the actor-audience relationship. I'm starting us off with a quotation from a theater professor of mine, Tracy C. Davis at Northwestern University. She says, "In order to be theater, it must have witnesses." I'd like you to think about her word choices here and think about what that means to be a witness. Now, I always think it's good to start defining terms. So let's start with the most basic one of all. What is theater and what happens there? The word theater comes from the Greek word theatron, which translates roughly into the seeing place, a place to behold things. In ancient Greece, they had theater. Theater was performed outside. So they did dedicate spaces to the performing of theaters, but these were outdoor spaces. It really wasn't until the 1600s or so that we started really having theater regularly indoors, at which point we started referring to theater as a literal physical building. And of course, now the word theater can refer to lots of um, places of action. You think about like the theater of war, for example. But I think it's always good to start with our root, and that's from this Greek word theatron, the seeing place. And in the theater, we're going to have our audience, which we define as a group of listeners. The word audience comes from a medieval French word that means the act or state of hearing, the action or condition of listening. And its root in Old French comes from a term that means to perceive physically or to grasp. So there's kind of a lot going on with that single word, but generally we're talking about perceiving something through our hearing. So we go to the seeing place to perceive or grasp something through our hearing. So engaging in theater is a multi-sensory experience right off the bat. Right. I'm sure from grammar school you remember the five senses. Now, as audience members, we're mostly engaged in the seeing and hearing. Um, it's interesting, our focus today tends to be on the seeing. We're all there for the visual spectacle, the costumes, the scenery, the special effects. But one used to say, back in, say, Shakespeare's time, people used to say, "Oh, I went to hear a play today." Back in Shakespeare's time, we didn't have as sophisticated lighting as we do today and special effects and things like that. So the focus tended to be more on the language and the words that the actors were speaking. But of course, they were seeing action happening on stage too. But why I'm saying it's a multi-sensory experience, because if we are being truly lively and attentive audience members, our brains are having many of the tactile and olfactory and taste sensations of the characters. If a character is doing something or tasting something or smelling something, we can kind of imagine that sense of touch or that taste or that smell from our seats in the audience. Which to me kind of sounds like a magic spell, right? But really, live theater is a work of chemistry between actors and the audience. It is a process that engages both the head and the heart of the viewer and the guts. And it relies on audience expectations and experience, as well as the skills of the performers for success. You can't have theater without an audience. You need an audience for there to be theater just as much as you need actors for there to be theater. And the coolest thing, I think, about theater, when you get actors and audiences together in a place performing theater, every single performance is going to be different. Usually you've got a different audience every day, even if you have the same actors every day. Sometimes the actors get replaced with understudies, or somebody leaves the show and they hire someone new. But even if you have the exact same actors and the exact same audience in the space day after day after day, the performance is still going to be different every time. But I want to take a little time kind of unpacking some of this head and heart and guts interaction that the audience is going to engage in. So the first thing I want to talk about is empathy, which we define as emotional identification. So, this is a feeling that we've probably all experienced, right? And it's something that is stronger than sympathy, right? Sympathy is when you feel for somebody. Oh, that person looks like they're having a hard time. I feel bad for them. That's sympathy. Empathy is literally feeling what the other person is feeling. That person is sad. I too am sad because that person is sad. Little kids are really naturals at empathy. If you've ever been in a room with babies and one baby starts to cry, pretty soon all of the other babies start to cry, even though they were happy just a minute ago and nothing has really changed. They hear that cry of distress and they're distressed as well. We have a similar reaction going on in theater. When we are directly involving empathy, we are feeling along with the characters. We are experiencing in our brains and in our hearts and in our guts what the characters are experiencing on stage from the safety of our seats. And this act of engaging with emotional identification is what draws us into the world of the play. But when we are going to the theater, we are also engaging in something called aesthetic distance, which is psychological separation or emotional attachment. Because we know that what's going on stage isn't really happening. And aesthetic distance is what allows us to kind of remember at the back of our minds that this is only a play. Again, little kids, they have a tough time with this. If you have ever been to a play where little kids are watching, they get really, really engaged, right? Their empathy is all in motion and they're really feeling along with those characters so that they will oftentimes stand up and yell out at the characters, don't be mean to her or whatever. And sometimes little kids get so distressed because that line between fantasy and reality is hard for them to navigate. They lack the fully developed sense of aesthetic distance that we as adults can understand very easily. And this is important because if we didn't have this emotional detachment and we were watching, say, Romeo and Juliet, where there is a sword fight in the middle of the play and Tybalt gets stabbed and Mercutio gets stabbed and Romeo almost gets stabbed, if we were thinking this is something that's happening in real life, we might do one of several things. We might scream and run for the exits. We might leap on stage and try to separate the sword fighters if we were feeling particularly brave. If we weren't feeling confident in our own sword fighting skills, we might at least pull out our phones and dial 911. Any of which of those things would be very disruptive to the theatrical event. So it's good to have aesthetic distance. But beyond than just reminding yourself that this is only a play, aesthetic distance does something else. It, by keeping our emotions at bay a little bit, it allows us to kind of objectively understand what's going on with the characters and events that are unfolding on the stage. And it allows us to apply some judgment and make some judgment calls about what we're seeing. Because when we're totally emotionally engaged in something, if we're really feeling something right along with somebody else, we're not necessarily going to be objective and think about the rightness or wrongness or appropriateness or whether or not something is a good idea. We're in it, we're ride or die. When we have aesthetic distance, we're like, oh, that was probably a mistake what they did there. So good to have. And the cool thing is that during a theatrical performance, we are doing both of these things often simultaneously. This is not an on-off switch. It's not binary. It's more of a continuum, or think of it as a dimmer switch, right? Our head and our heart are going to be more or less engaged at varying moments throughout the play. Plays are often built this way for us to be more or less engaged at different points in the performance. And the success of an individual performance is going to draw us in more or push us away a little bit more. And what's going on in our own headspace sometimes is going to allow us to kind of immerse ourselves in the play more or less. So it's a very, very individuated experience. And you've probably never thought about this before, right? But now that I've laid it out for you, you're like, oh yeah, of course, I do that all the time. And obviously you don't just do that with plays, but you do that with movies, you do that with TV shows, you do that with novels, right? You do that with video games, right? All the time. So this kind of crosses all kinds of genres of art. But even though we're not necessarily consciously aware of it, it's good to kind of think of it as like this subconscious contract that we have signed with the production company that's putting on a play. And one of the key components to this kind of imaginary subconscious contract is something called the willing suspension of disbelief. Okay, so three components to that. Willing, meaning that it's conscious and active. Suspension, meaning we're putting something to the side. Disbelief, right? Not believing something. So we are consciously choosing to set aside our skepticism. That's something that the audience does, and that's something that the actors do. The actors are promising to commit to presenting characters and events as if they were real. That they are going to do their best to convince us that they are kings or queens or fairies or monsters or whatever on the stage, and that they are really falling in love or plotting to take over a kingdom, or having some sort of disaster befall them, or having some really crazy comedic slapstick event happen to them, and they are going to commit to presenting those things as real even though they're not. And on the flip side of that, the audience promises to pretend that what is happening is really happening, and that it's happening to real people for the first time, and this is actual life. And at the same time, we're both promising to remember at the back of our minds that it's not really real. And it's this tension of real, not real that allows us to enjoy a performance and allows us to kind of like understand when, oh, things have gone awry with this performance. Either there's a fire in the theater, or an actor has, forgotten their lines, or somebody's had a heart attack either on stage or in the audience. And so we need to stop things so that we can get things put right, right? So this is kind of going on at the back of our minds all the time. It's real, but it's not real. But the more we can kind of push that not real piece of it to the back of our minds, the richer experience we're going to have witnessing the play. And something that's going to help us maintain our willing suspension of disbelief is being aware of what conventions are in place. What do I mean by that? Well, a convention is a way of doing or presenting something in a play that departs from reality, but we accept as true. And it's a whole set of codes of behavior and also kind of like secret codes in performance itself that we agree to accept as shorthand for the reality that we can't quite make happen, but are going to pretend is happening. So one convention that we have in 20th and 21st century theater is that the area on stage is brightly lit and the area where the audience is sitting is dark during a performance. And right before a performance starts, right, we can't have it dark when we go into the theater. We'd stumble around and bonk our shins on things. So it's brightly lit when we come and sit down. And the convention is that, we all take our time, take off our coats, look through the program, cough our last cough, make sure we've gone to the bathroom, turned off our freaking cell phones, right? And then a couple minutes before the show starts, the house lights, right, the lights over the audience will blink, or they'll start to slowly fade, and the audience understands, oh, this is the time for us to be quiet and put everything away and focus all of our attention on the stage where their lights are about to brighten or rise. So that is a common convention in the present day in America, that is a little kind of ritual behavior that lets us know the play is starting and we're going to focus our attention on the play. Obviously, turning the lights down low in the audience helps focus our attention because we're not going to be distracted by the people around us because we can't see them as well. And our attention is going to be focused on the brightly lit area where the performances are. But obviously, this is not a convention that has been universal across the planet or throughout time. As I just told you, in ancient Greece and in Shakespeare's time, plays were held outside. So our light was the sun, and you couldn't separate the lighting from the stage and the audience because you were both outside. So they had some sort of different convention that we don't really know too much about how they signaled to the audience that the show was beginning. Here's another example of that kind of like coded shorthand in a theater convention, right? This is a scene from Moon for the Misbegotten, and it is taking place at night. You probably knew that just by looking at it. And the reason why we know that it's night is because there's this very deep blue light on these actors. If we were doing this completely realistic and we were outside at night, right, this looks like the back porch of a farmhouse. So if we were outside at night in the dark, it would be dark. And we wouldn't be able to see each other, and we wouldn't be able to see the things around us, and we'd be kind of stumbly. Well, that's not really safe for the actors, nor is it particularly interesting for the audience to stare at darkness where we can't make out shapes very well at all or determine what action is happening because we can't see it. So we want to communicate this idea of darkness, but we still want to be able to see. And so what we have come up with in the 20th century and 21st century is lighting the stage in these kind of deep blue lights. And when we see that dark blue on the stage, we're like, oh, okay, it's nighttime. We're outside and it's dark. And you can see also they've still added a whiter light on the actors in the center of this photo so that the audience's direct attention is directed to those actors doing their acting. So even though we've covered the stage in deep blue light, we still need that extra visibility on the actors that we want to see. So this is a convention. This is not realistic. This is not what moonlight really looks like in real life and not how people look when they're outside in the moonlight. But we are using this kind of artificial shorthand so that we can get the most information out of the moment. Here's another one that if you've ever seen an action movie, you have probably seen this convention employed. The bad guy has planted a bomb somewhere, and we only have a certain amount of time left before things go boom, and our hero needs to defuse the bomb and rescue the people before disaster strikes. So the audience and sometimes the characters can see the clock ticking down from whatever time it was set at to 0. Now, I'm not a professional bomb maker, so I don't have this on professional authority, but I can't imagine that if I was someone bent on doing somebody harm, that I would put a big, distracting, look over here, attention-getting clock that was ticking down just how many seconds one had left to diffuse it, right? This is not typically how these devices are made. But having this clock ticking down and having the screen show us the ticking down on that timer every few seconds while our hero is desperately trying to save the day really ratchets up our expectation, the audience, and our tension. And so even though this isn't how it would realistically be done, this is a convention that really helps dramatize the action and keep our empathy engaged. Now, there are lots of other kinds of conventions that are going on in theater today. Things like the audience is expected to be quiet during a performance, but not so quiet that the actors can't tell that they are there, right? We want audiences to laugh when it's funny. We want audiences to clap after a musical number or after an act, and we want them to show their appreciation with wild and thunderous applause at the end of a performance. Sometimes we're going to have a curtain that's going to raise and lower between or before and after an act, right? There are lots of different things. I'm sure you can think of some more. Maybe come up with a list in your head to discuss with us and share in class. So let's take a few minutes to think about how do audiences impact performance, right? Because I said that theater was a work of chemistry between actors and audiences, right? So when actors are performing, even when the audience is being quiet and attentive, and because it's dark in the house, the actors can't really see the audience members, they know that the audience is there. And the actors' bodies, even though they're kind of devoting themselves fully to creating a believable performance, they're still keeping a little feeler out for how is this being perceived by my audience, right? And it's sort of like this electrical connection between the performers and the audience. And while individual responses in the audience are going to vary because we are all unique individual human beings, each audience is going to take on a kind of collective personality. And the actors are going to sense that coming back from an audience. Sometimes an audience is really quiet, sometimes an audience is a little restless, sometimes an audience is, very attuned to the jokes, sometimes an audience is a little bit more contemplative. But the actors are going to feel that and feed off of it, and how an audience responds to the play is going to sometimes impact how the actors continue. Now, a good professional actor is going to give their best work no matter how an audience is behaving. I don't mean to say, like, if you're good for me, I'm going to be good for you, but I'm saying that this is like a symbiotic relationship where the energy from the audience feeds the energy of the actors, and the energy of the actors feeds the energy of the audience. And when it's all really working, it's just this kind of amazing feedback loop. But to get that kind of magic happening, everybody kind of needs to be on the same page. So, what expectations do audiences have when they go to a theater, right? Think about theater events that you have been to. What were your expectations? What did you think was going to happen? How do you know you got your money's worth? And think too about what are the expectations that the performers are going to have of their audiences. And then ask yourself, what might happen when these expectations are met, or when they're exceeded, or when they're not met? And how might all of that impact a performance, whether we're talking about audience expectations or performer expectations? I'd like to talk about this with you next time in class. So take your time responding to these questions, and we will discuss further.